Dr. Yoshikawa.
Thanks so much, Laura. It's a real delight to be here at the first symposium of the Crane Center, and to see such a close collaboration between the business world, government, the civil sector, and research. And Laura is kind of a superstar in her field, who really straddles research, practice, and policy, is really a perfect leader for this center, and it's very exciting to see the amount of interest and the groundswell, because that's really what it's going to take to bring high-quality preschool education to scale in Columbus and across the state of Ohio. And I do have to say we're at a kind of remarkable historical moment for those of us, you know, like Laura or Andy or Stephanie, and I've been in the field for a long time. It's kind of extraordinary that for example, a large city mayor, a tall city mayor like Bill de Blasio was able to run and successfully win the mayoralty of the city of New York, running on preschool education as his #1 issue. So we are at a wonderful time. I do think that research made a difference in the fact that this has become part of the public discourse. As a colleague of mine who runs a foundation in Europe on early childhood development said, there is no other sector that has such a strong research and evidence base. Name another sector that has the background from neuroscience, from economics, from developmental psychology, that has accumulated over the past 5 decades. So really, you know, we're used to research taking a very long time to make it into policy, so 5 decades, you could argue, is not super fast, but I think we're really at a very exciting time in the field. So I'm going to, I think Andy did such a great job that I might go faster than, because some of the points are really very much in agreement, though perhaps using some different phrases or wording, but I think we're very much in agreement around the state of the evidence base. And what I'm going to present is first the summary of a report called Investing in Our Future, the evidence base on preschool education, that I worked on with a group of preschool education scholars. This was actually a really fun group to work with. Chris Weiland, Jeannie Brooks-Gunn, Peg Birchnall, Linda Espinosa, Bill Gormley, Jens Ludwig, Catherine Magnuson, Deborah Phillips, and Marty Zaslow. But this was really the vision of Deborah Phillips when she was president of the Foundation for Child Development. What was going on, if you remember, just about a year and a half ago, was that there were, right after President Obama gave his State of the Union address, there were a lot of conflicting press accounts about the value of early childhood education. And I'm not going to name the particular kinds of media outlets, but there were certainly some that said, well, you know, we actually don't have a strong evidence base. A lot of questioning about whether it was actually worth the financial investment to expand preschool at scale, and particularly around universal preschool, which is what the president suggested and was very much part of his whole proposal, which is called Preschool for All. Right? So we decided we wanted to put together a synthesis of the evidence base that was written for policymakers, that was written in plain English, but had all the backing and endnotes and footnotes and references to Andy's work and Laura's work and the many, many other people who have, we think, produced a remarkable body of evidence, and a wave of evidence that is actually new, that comes across the last 15 years, that we think actually has particular relevance for this issue of how to implement quality at scale. So I'm going to summarize that, and then talk about one city's successful implementation. They're still in the middle of scaling up, but we think they've made some very smart decisions, and the evidence is showing some really quite impressive findings. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Boston Pre-K program. So this is the report, and I can share the link, or maybe, you know, Laura can share the link at the Crane Center as well. It's, it came out just about a year ago in October 2013. So we were trying to address some real policy questions. When we were talking to policymakers around the country, they tended to have some of the same sets of questions. Is preschool at scale truly worth the investment? What are the specific dimensions of quality that make a difference for children's outcomes? And that's where I think Andy really did a great job. I might go quicker through that. can quality preschool be implemented at scale? Where are the places that it's actually been done as far as the research shows? And we have to also pay attention in every early childhood system, in every social sector, we do need to pay attention to equity, in addition to access and quality. And so what are the effects of preschool for different important subgroups in the United States? We're in a country that is stratified by race, by income, by immigration status, by disability, and so those are some of the questions we thought were also very relevant to agency administrators and policymakers. So we decided to place particular emphasis on a recent wave of evidence, which is really lots of new studies, because we think it's time to move beyond the peri-preschool and the abecedarian studies as the sole basis for preschool policy. And this particularly exciting new wave of evidence across the last 15 years is what we put some emphasis on, while acknowledging just how important those early studies were. And we think this recent wave of evidence actually complements those landmark studies in a very nice way. We used fairly strict guidelines for including which studies we would cite. As Deborah Phillips put it, this was like we shrunk the National Academy of Sciences. Within about 5 months, we put together a report, but we tried to use those kinds of standards of rigor. And if you, any of you know the Shonkoff and Phillips report, From Neurons to Neighborhoods, how many of you have heard of that report? Yes, so probably over half of the folks in the room. Deborah Phillips was the second editor of that, and that was really the landmark National Academy of Sciences report in the year 2000 that really, I think, for the first time put together the neuroscience evidence with the economics evidence. So I'm going to take you through these policy questions and tell you what the evidence says, and then we'll have, I'm sure, an interesting Q&A later. So, can at-scale preschool work when it's universal? One set of evidence we drew on was a meta-analysis of over 80 of the most rigorous evaluations of preschool going back to 1960. So this is a large study that Greg Duncan, Catherine Magnuson, Holly Schindler, and I have been working on for the past 7 years. If any of you have done a meta-analysis, I'm not going to tell you what it is, but it's a quantitative, statistical approach to synthesizing studies. Everyone says you only do one in your life, because you actually take, well, so far I think it's taken 3 times longer than we thought, and we've got quite a lot of work still to do. And I think Catherine Magnuson was supposed to be here. Her husband's unfortunately ill, and so she couldn't make it, but we've been working together on this. And that meta-analysis shows that the average impact of 1 year of preschool, this is across the entire field of rigorous evaluations across the last 40 years, is about 1/3 of a year of additional learning beyond those who do not get that program. And so that's your average impact across these 84 or so studies of preschool. And so that shows, I think, first of all, and I should have showed this bubble graph. We have a bubble graph that shows where all those effects lie. And the vast majority are above 0, meaning that it is very, very rare for preschool education to have a negative effect. So despite the fact that some of that evidence, there have been some reports out, I think, in the public that focus on negative effects, that is very, very rare in this field. And that's why we actually do feel that on average, preschool education has a positive effect. Even in recent studies where many of the comparison group children, as Andy mentioned, are themselves in other centers or preschools. The newer evidence, and Andy mentioned the Tulsa program, and I'm going to tell you about the Boston program, is that at-scale, high-quality, universal public preschool can have substantial impacts on children's learning. And these 2 studies are showing larger effects than 1/3 of a year of additional learning. They're showing between half a year and a full year of additional learning above and beyond comparison groups, over half of which were in other centers and preschools. So think about that. In both Boston and Tulsa, the comparison groups, over half of them were in other centers and preschools, and yet these Tulsa and Boston programs produced 6 months to a year of additional learning in key areas around language, literacy, and math. So we think that's actually quite exciting recent evidence. It's one of the reasons we wanted to talk about this issue of scale. So which features of quality matter for children? This is the same set of evidence that Andy reviewed around structural quality, these issues of group size, adult-child ratio, teacher qualifications, and the process quality, which is what the child actually experiences in terms of interactions. This is how we summarized the evidence in one sentence. So just to answer Tanny's question, we think that structural quality features help to create the conditions for positive process quality, but they don't ensure that it will occur. So you can't simply invest in salaries and expect process quality to increase. There is this, and I think Andy put it nicely in terms of antecedents and processes and outcomes, there's evidence that higher structural conditions, better work conditions, better salaries influence process quality, increase the probability of high process quality, and then, as Andy showed, high process quality is really consistently linked to children's social and cognitive skills, but it's that kind of indirect association. And another example that I often like to describe around the links between structural quality and what children experience is that when salaries are low and work conditions are terrible, there is much higher teacher turnover. And so we all know that when children experience a lot of instability in their educational experiences, when systems experience high turnover, these are challenges for professional development and for learning across years. And so there are strong and powerful arguments to talk about the work conditions and the status of the early childhood workforce. The workforce that is responsible for brain architecture during the years when it is most malleable, growing the most rapidly, are also the least paid in terms of the workforce. And that says something about the priorities of our society, and in fact goes directly against the economist Jim Heckman's recommendations about where society should actually be investing in terms of workforce in education. So I think I'm not going to go through this slide in a lot of detail because Andy covered this issue of whether quality matters for children. Yes, it does. But the thing I'm going to add is that average quality on these measures like the class that Andy has done a lot of work on, the classroom assessment scoring system, or the ECHRS, average quality is in the middle range for emotional climate and classroom organization. So your median preschool teacher is at the median, in the middle level of the kind of good but not excellent range as far as the emotional supportiveness and warmth and responsiveness and individualized attention that she or he provides to children in her classroom. For the structuring of routines in the classroom, these things like classroom planning and organization, but it's an instructional quality, and again, I want to emphasize this, where on the 7-point scales, instructional quality and study after study averages around 2 on a 1 to 7 scale in the US. And that cuts across Head Start, it cuts across public pre-K, and many, many studies, including these multi-state studies of public pre-K. So that's something that we really have to be concerned about. Only a small minority of programs are in the excellent range on these measures. So that does raise this question: what are effective approaches to high quality? And we thought the most exciting evidence from the last 15 years was the idea of these 3 points when implemented together are, we think, a very promising route to high quality at scale. And these are developmentally focused instruction and curriculum that are actually not trying to do everything. So we have stronger evidence that developmentally focused curricula, let's say focused on language and literacy, focused on socio-emotional, focused on math skills, increase those skills over global curricula, which frankly are often more commonly used. So there is stronger evidence for these developmentally focused curricula, and there is particular promise when they are supported with intensive on-site coaching. And so although we don't have the experiments that then test what's the frequency of coaching that matters, in these successful studies, and there are about 10 to 12 of these studies, including some work that Laura has done in the area of language and literacy, that kind of intensive coaching, when paired with a developmentally specific curriculum, produces some very nice impacts in each of these different areas. So we have, in essence, a menu of evidence-based curricula, some in math, some in socio-emotional development and behavior management, and some in language and literacy. And we actually have some examples of combinations of those evidence-based curricula, and that's exactly what Boston did. So I'll tell you more about that in a minute. The other thing that successful systems are doing is regular monitoring of child progress. That's not high stakes. We're not talking about bringing high stakes testing to early childhood, but to inform teachers' practices. And so these kinds of formative assessments that allow teachers to adjust the content and their approach based on learning how individual children are doing and progressing across the preschool year. Again, this notion of formative assessments is really quite critical. So turning to the equity issues, are there positive effects of quality preschool education for different subgroups? Do certain subgroups benefit more than others? So one that we're certainly concerned about is socioeconomic status and economic disadvantage. And what we are finding is, in particular from the two recent large-scale studies that study universal pre-K programs, and so when you have a study of a universal pre-K program, you can actually look at whether the effects are similar or different for non-poor families and poor families. And in both of these recent examples in Tulsa and in Boston, it turned out the middle-class children benefited substantially. But the lower income, more disadvantaged children benefited substantially more. So it was actually a very a nice pattern of effects. You don't want to be harming or producing no effects among non-poor children. Both of these studies show that you can have robust effects for non-poor children, but the effects are larger for poor and disadvantaged children. And that's actually important recent evidence, because of those 84 or so rigorous studies of preschool education over the last 40 years, over 90% are on only economically disadvantaged families. So it's been a very long delayed research task to identify the effects of preschool education on those who are non-poor. And this is critical information for cities that are thinking about universal pre-K. We can talk more about that during the Q&A. I'm sure there'll be questions about that. When we reviewed the evidence across the field on differences by race, ethnicity, children of all racial ethnic groups benefit. There is no clear evidence that there are stronger or weaker effects for particular groups. What about dual language learners and children of immigrants? So here there's actually some very encouraging evidence from the Head Start Impact Study, from the studies in Boston and Tulsa, from some other studies, that the positive impacts on language and math outcomes of preschool education are as strong or stronger for dual language learners and children of immigrants. And this was certainly true in Tulsa and in Boston. And so maybe this is something that Laura could answer around, because I think there's some interesting basic developmental research that suggests why that might be. One of the things we find is that when children of immigrants and dual language learners are exposed to high quality instruction, they are capable of learning at even faster rates. In some ways they have more room to grow in terms of English language learning, but I would love to hear what Laura has to say about that particular issue if she has some real experience, and I'm sure there's others in the room who have that kind of research experience. Children with special needs. There are substantial benefits for this group, and these are in studies where children with special needs are mainstreamed into classrooms, such as Head Start. This is a very important piece of Head Start policy since it was founded, was to ensure that there are slots available for children with special needs. And the Head Start Impact Study, one of the positive findings there was that the impacts on cognitive skills were comparable for children with special needs. And that was the same in Tulsa. I do have to say, if there are students in the room, and I saw some posters around these issues, which is great, there's a lot more need for research in this area, and I think the Crane Center is already making a difference with the studies around this issue. So this critical question, what's the pattern of short versus long-term effects? It is true across the research literature, including the Preschool program, that test scores converge between those children who received preschool and those who did not. And there's evidence by Stephanie Curenton and others that, in fact, part of that is because preschool has focused on disadvantaged children. Disadvantaged children are simply more likely to enter lower quality school environments. That's because of how education policy is structured, certainly in this country. And so one of the critical hypotheses, as Andy mentioned, is that school quality may be an important mechanism for when effects are sustained from preschool education and when they are not. So far, for preschool at scale, there are some sustained impacts of Tulsa through 3rd grade for math, particularly among boys. And then it is important to remember that we have evidence from both Head Start and from the landmark small-scale studies, the Abecedarian Project, the Preschool, and the Chicago Parent-Child Centers, that there can be long-term effects despite test score fade-out. Long-term effects on high school graduation, reductions in delinquency, reductions in teen pregnancy, these important outcomes that are not fully captured by test scores in middle childhood and early adolescence. So what's the bottom line? What is the return on investment in quality preschool? We do know, we've known for quite a while, that it's a profitable investment from these small-scale demonstration programs like the Preschool, the Chicago program, and Abecedarian, with benefit ratio to cost ratios of 7-to-1 or higher for Perry and for Chicago. For Abecedarian, it's lower, and one of the reasons is it lasted much, much longer, right? So it started at 6 weeks and went to age 5. It provided center care full-time for those kids. That is simply a much higher cost, and it's still more than paid for itself with a benefit-cost ratio at the last estimate of about 2.5. And I don't think that included some long-term health outcomes that they have found since. So, and there's more recent evidence from the Tulsa program. The economist Tim Bartik did a benefit-cost ratio based solely on projected earnings from the impacts in kindergarten of the Tulsa program. And what he did was combine that Tulsa project with some recent estimates by the economist Raj Chetty at Harvard University about the relationship between kindergarten reading and math scores and adult earnings. And so what Tim found and Bill Gormley was that the benefit-cost ratio for Tulsa was between 3 and 5-to-1, depending on the assumption. So no matter which way you cut it, it looks like it's going to be saving the city of Tulsa money, including a robust ratio for non-poor children. Now that's really important, so that the benefit-cost ratio was above 1, meaning that it paid for itself based on projected earnings alone, not on other kinds of benefits, but just calculating for projected earnings benefits alone for non-poor kids, for middle-class kids, in other words. Okay, I'm going to wrap up with a little bit of a story of what Boston did, because as Columbus and as Ohio think about expanding pre-K, as New York has gone through a successful initial rollout with 51,000 children entering pre-K, which is quite a phenomenal effort. I do have a friend who's a teacher trainer in New York and working in the South Bronx, and she is loving her job. So so far it seems like they're doing something right, at least in her case, and they have been thinking a lot about what the support should be for quality, and we are, a group at NYU, we are working with them to try to make sure that they monitor quality and children's outcomes using the best available measures. So the Boston Pre-K program, I've already told you, it sounds promising. I'm going to actually show you some numbers. It did use this rigorous regression discontinuity design. Christina Weiland, she's one of these phenomenal doctoral students who come along once in a career when you're an advisor. But in her second year, she said, oh, I'm thinking of doing an evaluation study of the Boston Public Schools Pre-K program. She had been an Ed Pioneer Fellow for the summer and knew the Director of Early Childhood Services. So then the three of us had some conversations. We decided to apply for a large IES Department of Education grant. She got that grant. Certainly I helped her with it, but you know, this is really Christina's dissertation, and it's one of the historic studies of pre-K now. So it's quite, everyone should be able to do this dissertation, I think. Just talk to Chris. So 2018 children across the city of Boston from about 75 schools were included in this study. And quite a diverse student population in Boston. 11% Asian, of whom actually Southeast Asians were quite a group, as well as East Asian Chinese. 27% African American, 40% Latino, and 18% white, with about 27% having Spanish as their home language, about 22% other, a large mix of other languages, 50% English speaking. 69% of this sample received free or reduced price lunch, similar to many urban school districts in our country, 9% students with disabilities. So a thing to remember here is the majority of control group children were actually enrolled in other preschool programs or centers. So that's something to keep in mind. So what we found were some of the largest effects on language and math of public pre-K studies to date in the US. These are entirely comparable to the Tulsa effects. We had somewhat larger effects on vocabulary, somewhat smaller effects on letter word identification, which is a basic decoding skill, but larger effects on math. And I'll explain in a minute why such large effects on math. These are, when you see effect sizes like this, you know, you kind of like have, it's a special gold star day. When those data first rolled off her computer, I was like, oh, wow, you know, this is knowing the, as Andy said, we're perfectly happy with 0.2 effect sizes in education. And when you get things between 0.4 and 0.7, this is really happiness for geeks. But also those interested in quality preschool. So those were the core targeted, and I'll explain in a minute, the language and math curricula that were implemented at scale in Boston. Those are our key targeted outcomes. But we added a scientific question, which was, you know, when you target language and math, do you actually improve executive function skills? Who's heard about executive function skills here? Raise your hand. That's pretty good. I think over half the room has heard of executive function skills. What are executive function skills? Anyone want to give a sense of what they are? What's like an example of an executive function skill? Just shout it out.
Managing attention.
Managing attention, yep.
Regulating
self-regulation, yes. There's a whole group over there. What?
Inhibitory control.
What's that? Inhibitory control. What's that?
Ability to inhibit prepotent responses.
Ability to inhibit prepotent responses. Wow. Okay, so
Crane Center.
did anybody do that today? Well, actually, the example I usually give is, I just urged you all to display behavior that doesn't display executive function, which is simply to shout out without raising your hand. So a classroom behavior that shows inhibitory control is to raise your hand before shouting a question or an answer out, right? So yes, executive function skills are those, it's sometimes called the air traffic control of the brain. This comes from growth of the prefrontal cortex, which is around higher order thinking skills in the brain, and it is the ability not just to focus your attention, but to flexibly be able to shift the focus of that attention from one task to another. So if you think about what children end up doing in classrooms, in what we try to do in our workplaces, if we're not too overwhelmed with our iPhones, is to try to focus on one task and then shift to another task when it's appropriate and called for, as it is often in classroom situations. So what we found was these, that when there are robust effects on language and math, we do also see effects on executive function skills. I don't know why that's not showing. You'll have to take me for my word. It's just weird. Wow. Okay, well that doesn't look all that impressive. But, yes, we found, just read the top there. Okay, then we were also interested in whether the Boston pre-K program reduced disparities at kindergarten entry. We had those subgroups. You saw mentioned the different subgroups by income, by race, ethnicity. What we found was that every subgroup we looked at benefited in their skills, including non-poor children. The impacts were larger for children from lower income families, for Latino children, and dual language learner children. So, in other words, larger for lower income than for higher income, larger for Latino than for white, larger for dual language learner children than native kids coming from English-speaking families. And what was quite impressive was that the Boston pre-K program entirely closed the school readiness gap among poor and non-poor children in mathematics. It eliminated the school readiness gap between Latino and white children in early reading in mathematics, and it narrowed school readiness gaps substantially between white and Asian. And when I say Asian, these are largely immigrants. As I said, a big chunk of those were Vietnamese low-income families, Chinese low-income families, and between white and black students. So if, as is often claimed, we think of education as the great equalizer, then can quality preschool education help to equalize early school readiness gaps? The context for this is that school readiness gaps in reading and math skills are already large at the point of entry into kindergarten. And Catherine Magnuson, who's not here, has actually done some of the most significant studies on this topic, looking at national data sets, and showing that the size of that gap doesn't increase by all that much between preschool and high school, which is quite amazing, that the vast majority of the school readiness gap by income in the United States is already present on the first day of kindergarten. So we have to pay attention to when quality preschool education might be able to reduce the gaps. And this was a universal program, not targeted to the poor. And so it's quite promising that universal, and this is actually the story around public education, right? We tend to think public education should be an equalizer. And if you provide it universally, and if it's of high quality, it should still reduce gaps. And that's what we see from the Boston pre-K program. What about fidelity and quality? As I said before, typically in national studies, we are in around the middle of the scale on classroom quality for emotional climate and classroom organization, and that was true in Boston, but instructional support was substantially higher than in those national studies. So instructional support on the class was at a mean of 4.3 rather than what is typical, which is somewhere in the low 2s. And that is at least a 2 to 3 standard deviation difference between those national studies and what Boston was able to achieve at scale. Yeah, so there we go. We were citing some of Andy and Bob Pianta's work there. So getting to quality at scale, how did Boston do it? And what are the current developments? For this, I have to thank Jason Sachs, the Director of Early Childhood, who was actually the person who vision, this new system of improving quality. The initial impetus was the mayor. And so Mayor Menino launched pre-K for 3- and 4-year-olds within Boston Public Schools in 2005. This was a school-based effort. Different cities do it different ways. Seattle is going to do it starting with the community providers. New York is doing it with the full mix, because when you're enrolling 51,000 children, you got to work across systems. But Boston started in the public school system, created a Department of Early Childhood, and oh, there's pieces missing here. What happened, there's a bullet missing here. Jason Sachs decided to take the pulse of the emerging system by picking a random sample of classrooms, 40 classrooms, and measuring quality using the Eckers and the class, and found that the quality was actually quite mediocre. And so instructional quality was much more along those national averages of around 2 on a 7-point scale. And so Jason convinced the mayor to stop the expansion and use the money that would have gone to the next 20 classrooms and instead focus on a quality improvement system through intensive coaching and through the implementation of 2 evidence-based curricula. So he went and got like a lot of input from academics and implemented 1 language and 1 math curriculum, but he actually tweaked each of those to make sure that they could be implemented together feasibly by preschool teachers. And so that's something that is, I think, a very important piece of the story, which is that curricula, the vast majority of these curricula were implemented, but overlap was reduced, for example. So, so that's very important. So that's essentially the story. The coaching was once, depending on the teacher and the teacher's needs, it was either every other week or every week. And so the ratio of coaches to classrooms was 1 coach per 10 to 12 classrooms. The back of the envelope cost estimate, we're right now going through all the files of BPS with a follow-up IES grant. Part of it is to do the full cost study of Boston. The back of the envelope estimate is that it was roughly $12,000 per child. So quality is not necessarily cheap. On the other hand, it's not twice as much as Head Start, for example. It's, I think we heard yesterday, it's between $8,000 and $9,000 a year for a slot here in Columbus. And certainly it's in the context of Boston, which has really quite high teacher salaries, and in fact requires master's degrees within 5 years of starting as a teacher, and that's the situation in Boston. The current BPS pre-K program is not yet reaching everybody. It's still scaling up. 2,300 seats for 4-year-olds. There's the cost estimate. It's in 85% of Boston's 78 elementary schools. It is free for parents, and there is a waiting list, so there's a bit of a lottery these days for getting in. It's a full-day program with a 22 to 2 ratio with 1 teacher and 1 paraprofessional per classroom, with teachers on the same pay scale as the K-12 system and with the same educational requirements. I think I said most of this. The proven language, literacy, and math curricula were supplemented with this coaching over 3 years. And they also piloted the NACE process, the National Association for the Education of Young Children accreditation process in 15 schools. They created principal trainings. They created paraprofessional trainings. There were ongoing seminars that supplemented the coaching. So there was roughly once every 6 weeks or 2 months, there was an actual topical seminar to accompany the coaching. There were curriculum guides for parents. And again, what's I think very important is this taking the pulse with true quality observational assessments like the class. And so Jason invests in quality monitoring on a subsample of 40 classrooms every 2 years. You can monitor the pulse of a system's quality without measuring quality in every single classroom. That's an important thing because I think a lot of people get concerned about how expensive it is to use the class. So Jason is expanding out and up. And so out to community providers. Up till now, it's been a system that only the lucky BPS preschool teachers have had access to. Now 15 community providers are getting access to the coaching and curricula supports, and they have gotten salary boosts to begin to address this gap between their salaries and the Boston Public School teachers' salaries. And if you looked at New York City's recent policy developments, New York City is doing exactly the same thing because they don't want everyone, all the best teachers, to flee from the community provider settings into the schools, right? So New York City is also providing some pretty substantial salary boosts to the community providers who are implementing UPK in New York City. So some of the descriptive findings are that the coaches have been impressed at how much the community providers have been responsive to the coaching and the curricula. And the professional development does become more differentiated. There's more variation among the community providers. And they have been providing more training to the director level. And I think the issue of leadership support is very important in early childhood education as these expand. The other thing Jason is doing is expanding up through K through 3. Because of the impressive effects of the preschool program, he's been allowed to pilot with kindergarten curricula and is moving ahead to first, second, and third grade curricula over the coming years. So right now there's a pilot in kindergarten that is building on the fact that kids are now coming in from the preschool program with higher levels of skills. You can do more with them. And so he's doing more constructivist kinds of project-based learning while supporting and building on the benefits of these language and math curricula in the 4-year-old year. So 50 schools have volunteered for the first year of a K through 3 reform effort. They will be evaluating effects on teaching practices and child outcomes, and will be creating professional development for grades 1 and 2. The pilot for kindergarten is going on right now. So I would certainly recommend bringing Jason in if you want to hear more about the details. He's quite effective and a visionary for pre-K at scale. So what are we learning? High quality preschool can be achieved at scale. The key is to promote instructional quality as a central goal, with quality supports provided at multiple levels, but also supports for salary in the community provider sector of quality preschool. And so expanding access, just like Andy said, has to be about expanding access to high quality preschool. And the quality of K through 3 matters, and that has to be the next target, or a simultaneous target, for reform. There is a nice video of the Boston Pre-K program. It's about 6 minutes long. It's available at restoringopportunity.com. So this is profiled in a recent book about evidence-based ways to reduce educational inequalities in the United States by Greg Duncan and Dick Bernay. So lots of people to thank, but we look forward to the discussion.